I bought this grave of a farm for one reason: to finally be left alone. No more radios, no more debriefs, just me, the wind, and 10 acres of silence. But the silence here had a crack in it, a sound that didn't fit the landscape. A low, rhythmic scratching, then a whine so thin it felt like a needle in my ear. The civilian in me wanted to keep unpacking. The seal in me was already hunting. This wasn't a stray cat. This was something trapped, something that didn't want to be found. You don't chain a barn door like that to keep the wind out. You do it to keep a secret in. My peace was over before it even started. My gut told me I was stepping into a trap. The air was cold, smelling of stale copper and fear. I moved into the kill zone. I expected a squatter. I found a soldier in fur, guarding a truth that could get us both killed.
She was broken, but she wasn't defeated. I've seen that look in the eyes of brothers in arms who refuse to leave the line. She wasn't just hiding, she was holding a position. Easy, girl. I'm not the one who put that chain on the door. My voice was a low rumble, the same frequency I used to calm rookies before a jump. She didn't bite, but the growl stayed in her chest. My eyes scanned the perimeter. Professional habit. I noticed the floorboards weren't just old, they were scarred. Someone had dragged something heavy across this room recently, something they wanted to disappear. Trust is a currency you earn in inches. I watched her nostrils flare. Hunger is a powerful motivator, but for her, duty seemed to come first. She looked at the food, then back at my throat. That's when I saw it. Tucked into the fur of her neck wasn't a standard collar. It was a thick leather strap with a heavy brass buckle, old-school military style. No tags, no name, only a serial number. She let me touch her. The moment my hand met her fur, the air in the barn shifted. We were no longer stranger and beast. We were a team. And then I felt the cold metal beneath her. This wasn't farm equipment. It was a high-grade, waterproof document canister, the kind used for long-term caches in hostile territory. The dog wasn't just trapped here, she was the last line of defense for whatever was inside. I realized then that my peaceful retirement was a fantasy. This farm wasn't a sanctuary, it was a crime scene waiting to be discovered, and someone was likely on their way to finish the job.
The serial number on her collar wasn't from a local kennel. I recognized the font. It was etched with a fiber laser, the kind used by private military contractors. This dog wasn't a pet, she was high-value hardware. As I cleaned her gash, I realized it wasn't from a wire fence. It was a grazing shot from a suppressed weapon. Someone had tried to neutralize her without making a sound, and they had failed. She had crawled back here to guard the one thing they couldn't find. Every instinct told me to bury this thing and drive until the gas ran out, but curiosity is a seal's second shadow. I twisted the cap. The seal broke with a soft hiss of pressurized nitrogen, state-of-the-art preservation. Inside, there were no maps or gold bars, just a single encrypted drive and a weathered photograph. I pulled it out, and the air left my lungs. It was a photo of 3 men in desert gear, their faces blurred by time, standing right in front of this very farmhouse 20 years ago. One of those men was my father's old teammate, a man who supposedly died in a helicopter crash in '04. The official report said no remains were recovered. Yet here he was, standing on my new porch, holding a canister that shouldn't exist. This farm wasn't a random purchase from a real estate site. The algorithm that recommended this place to me hadn't been a coincidence. I had been led here by someone who knew my history better than I did. Movement on the horizon. 2 SUVs, blacked out, moving in a tactical staggered formation. They weren't lost tourists. They were using night vision, creeping up the driveway like wolves in the tall grass. They knew the canister was here, and they likely knew the dog had survived. My piece was a trap, and I had just walked right into the center of the kill box. They didn't want the land. They wanted to erase the evidence I was currently holding. I had 3 minutes, maybe less. In a direct firefight, the odds were stacked against me, and the dog couldn't run yet. I had to change the game. I stopped being a homeowner and started being a ghost. I grabbed my gear, whistled low to the shepherd, and watched as her ears pinned back. She understood. We weren't the prey anymore. We were the environment, and the environment was about to become very hostile for our uninvited guests. I remembered the layout of the barn from the blueprints I'd studied before buying. There was a cellar entrance hidden behind the grain silos. If I could lure them inside and slip out the back, I could flank them. But these weren't amateurs. As the engines cut out and the doors clicked open, I heard the distinctive click of professional safety catches being disengaged. The hunters had arrived, but they had no idea they were walking into a SEAL's classroom. In the teams, they teach you that shadows are your only honest friends. I watched from the rafters as the 2 men broke the threshold, their movements fluid, synchronized. Tier 1 operators, no doubt about it. They didn't flood the room with noise. They let the silence work for them, sweeping their high-lumen beams in a standard diamond pattern that left no corner unvetted. My breath was a ghost, slowed down to a rhythmic hum that barely vibrated in my chest, a technique learned in the mountains of the Hindu Kush to mask presence from thermal sensors. I'd intended to misdirect them with a noise at the far end of the loft, but these weren't men who chased ghosts. They moved with a predatory certainty, their boots barely disturbing the decade-old dust on the floorboards. The lead man stopped dead, his beam locking onto the exact spot where Shepard had been bleeding only an hour before. He knelt, not like a farmer, but like a forensic scout, touching the residue of the copper-scented blood. His head tilted up, his eyes catching the faint glint of my tactical watch. He didn't shout, he simply pointed. He'd found me. The drop from the rafters was 10 feet of gravity I used to reset the board. I landed in a crouch, the shock absorbed by my heels, but before I could pivot into a defensive stance, the beams were blinding me. Commander James, we know the resume, we know the medals, but this isn't a jungle in South America and you aren't backed by a carrier group anymore. The leader's voice was a practiced rasp, the kind of tone used by men who negotiate for a living but kill for a hobby. He didn't reach for a sidearm. That was the ultimate insult, a sign that he considered me neutralized before the fight even started. He gestured with a gloved hand, and his subordinate stepped forward, pulling the heavy-duty polymer zip ties from a tactical belt. These weren't the cheap ones you find in a hardware store. These were reinforced with a steel core, designed to hold men who could break bricks with their bare hands. I watched their hands, looking for a twitch, a tell, a weakness in their formation. But they were a wall. For the first time in a decade, I felt the cold realization that my retirement might end in a shallow grave on my own property. I let them take my hands. Sometimes, to win the war, you have to lose the first skirmish. The pillar was solid oak, probably older than the state itself, and the zip ties were cinched so tight I could feel the pulse in my thumbs. They'd tied me high, forcing my shoulders into a strain that made every breath a calculated effort. Victor, the name the younger one used, began to pace a circle around me, a classic interrogation tactic meant to keep the subject's neck moving and their focus fractured. He looked at the empty olive-drab canister on the workbench, his expression unreadable behind the ballistic mask. "You've spent your life protecting secrets, James. You should know that some things are buried for a reason, not because they're forgotten, but because they are toxic." He leaned into my personal space, his breath smelling of stale coffee and peppermint. I didn't look at him. I was looking at the way the moonlight hit the rafters, searching for the silhouette of a German shepherd who was currently my only hope. She was a shadow among shadows, waiting for the one frequency she'd been trained to recognize. I could feel the adrenaline beginning to burn in my veins, that familiar chemical fire that clears the mind of everything except survival and the mission. "Your father's old team, They weren't the icons you remember. They were the cleanup crew for a series of errors that would have bankrupted 3 different administrations. Victor's voice was a low, seductive hum, the kind of psychological warfare meant to dismantle a man's identity before dismantling his body. He was trying to plant the seed of betrayal, telling me that the man I'd idolized was just another pawn in a game played by monsters. He spoke of offshore accounts, of liquidated assets, and of a helicopter crash that was orchestrated to silence the only voices left with a conscience. He was watching for a flinch, a narrowing of the eyes, a tightening of the jaw, any biological sign that his words were hitting the target. But I'd been interrogated by professionals in places that don't appear on maps. I kept my face as blank as a fresh sheet of ice. Behind me, the wood of the pillar was rough, biting into my skin, but it was also my greatest ally. I could feel every knot and splinter, mapping the surface with my touch, searching for the one flaw in the timber that would give me a fighting chance against the plastic biting into my wrists.
Victor pulled a tablet from his vest, the screen glowing with a sterile blue light. He swiped through images, surveillance footage of the local hospital. There he was, Miller, my father's last living teammate, looking like a ghost under a thin hospital sheet. He's on a ventilator, James, a very expensive, very fragile ventilator. One command from this tablet and the power goes out. No backup, no miracle, just silence. The leverage was perfect. They didn't need to hurt me to break me. They just needed to show me the cost of my defiance. But as Victor ranted about the greater good and the necessity of silence, my fingers found it. A small oxidized head of a nail, perhaps left by a farmer 50 years ago to hang a lantern. It was less than half an inch long, but in the world of tactical escape, it was a mountain. I shifted my weight, masking the movement with a cough, feeling the sharp, rusted edge of the nail catch against the edge of the polymer tie. It was a game of millimeters. If Victor saw me moving, he'd tighten the ties until the bone snapped. If he didn't, I had a way out. The sound of plastic against rusted iron is a scream in a silent room, so I had to time my movements with the wind outside and the heavy thud of Victor's boots. Every time he turned his back to pace, I grated the tie against the nail, feeling the heat of friction on my skin. He was showing me digital records now, trying to prove that my father's team had stolen the very drive I had hidden. They were going to sell it to the highest bidder, James. Your father was the only one who tried to stop them, and look where it got him. The lie was clumsy, but it served a purpose. It kept him talking. Professional interrogators love the sound of their own logic. While he was busy rewriting my family history, I was focused on the structural integrity of a single piece of industrial plastic. I could feel the first layer of the tie give way. The tension changed. It wasn't a snap yet, just a softening. I needed a distraction. I needed Shepard to move from being an observer to being a participant in this chaotic theater.
I caught a flash of amber in the corner of my eye. Shepard was moving, not with the frantic energy of a wounded animal, but with the calculated stealth of a canine unit. She knew the younger operative was the weak link. He was the one looking at the tablet, his curiosity overriding his training. He wanted to see the secrets Victor was boasting about. Shepard stayed low, her belly fur brushing the hay, her breathing synchronized with the rustle of the wind against the barn siding. She was waiting for me. I gave the faintest whistle, a sound so high-pitched it would be lost to human ears amidst the creaking of the old wood. It was the command for distract. She didn't bark. She didn't growl. She simply knocked over an old metal bucket near the grain silo, then vanished back into the dark before the sound even hit the walls. The bucket clattered, a sharp metallic ring that sent the younger operative into a crouch, his light whipping toward the silo. Victor stopped talking, his hand moving to the grip of his holstered weapon. "Check it," Victor barked. As the younger man walked past a stack of crates, Shepard struck. She didn't bite to kill. She lunged from the shadows, her teeth snagging the heavy fabric of his tactical trousers, giving a sharp, violent tug that threw him off balance. He let out a yelp of pure surprise, spinning in a circle, his flashlight beam dancing wildly across the ceiling.
"It's the dog! The damned dog is still alive!" he shouted, his professional veneer cracking under the sudden, phantom-like assault. Victor moved toward him, cursing, his back finally turned to me for more than a few seconds. That was the moment. I threw all my weight forward, the rusted nail biting deep into the plastic and my own skin. The zip tie snapped with a sound like a pistol shot, but the operative's shouting and Shepard's tactical barking drowned it out. My hands were free, but they were numb, tingling with the sudden rush of blood. I didn't reach for them yet. I reached for the hidden pocket in my waistband, pulling out a ceramic shim, a non-metallic tool I'd kept for exactly this kind of retirement party. I stood up, the shadows of the pillar masking my height. Victor was still 10 feet away, distracted by his partner's incompetence. He thought he was the one in control of the narrative, but the story had just changed authors. I wasn't the victim in the chair anymore. I was the wolf who had finally slipped the leash. I didn't stay to fight. A SEAL knows that the objective is the only thing that matters, and right now, the objective was the data and the man in the hospital. I slipped out of the side door, moving through the tall grass like a predator in its home range. The black SUV was idling near the gate, arrogance in the form of a running engine. I slid under the chassis, my shim finding the main wiring harness for the ignition system. One clean cut, one redirected wire. The engine coughed and died, the electronics flickering into a permanent sleep. Inside the barn, I could hear Victor's muffled roars of frustration as he realized the chair was empty. Shepard led them on a chase toward the old silos, her barks sounding more like laughter with every passing second. They had the gear, the tablet, and the threats. But I had the farm. I had the dog. And most importantly, I finally had the truth. The hunt was no longer in the barn. It was on the open road. The road ahead was a ribbon of black asphalt cutting through the heart of a conspiracy that had stayed buried for 2 decades. I didn't head straight for the hospital. That's what a novice would do. Instead, I pulled into a darkened rest stop 5 miles out, the engine of my pickup ticking as it cooled. Shepard sat in the passenger seat, her ears twitching at every rustle of the wind, a silent partner in a game of high-stakes digital chess. I plugged the drive into my deck. The encryption was a multi-layered beast, military grade, designed by someone who understood that time is the ultimate firewall, but they hadn't accounted for the decryption key I'd found, etched on the inside of the canister's lid, a series of coordinates and dates that matched my father's final deployment logs. As the progress bar crawled forward, the files began to bloom on the screen. It wasn't just data, it was a ledger of betrayal. It detailed a shadow operation known as Project Nightingale, a massive embezzlement scheme disguised as a hardware recovery mission. My father and his team weren't rogue soldiers. They were the whistleblowers who were about to expose the rot at the top. They didn't die in an accident. They were erased to protect the bottom line of a conglomerate that bought and sold wars like commodities. One name kept appearing at the bottom of the authorization forms: General Silas Vance, a man who had stood at my father's funeral and handed my mother a folded flag with a tear in his eye. The hypocrisy felt like a physical weight in my chest. Vance hadn't just climbed the ranks, he had built his career on the graves of the men who trusted him most. The drive contained recorded conversations, grainy but clear enough to identify voices. They were discussing the liquidation of the unit. They talked about my father like he was a broken piece of equipment that needed to be discarded. I felt a cold, sharp clarity wash over me. This wasn't just a rescue mission anymore. This was an audit, and I was the one sent to collect the debt. Shepard let out a low, sympathetic whine, her golden eyes reflecting the scrolling text. She had been there when they tried to silence Miller. She was the witness they couldn't intimidate. We had the evidence, but Vance had the infrastructure. To get to Miller, I wouldn't just need a gun. I'd need to dismantle a ghost. The hospital looked like a fortress disguised as a place of healing. The St. Jude's private wing was a high-security bubble, paid for by a shell company linked directly to Vance. I watched from across the street, my binoculars mapping the guard rotations.
They were using a standard two-man overlap, no gaps longer than 15 seconds. They were confident, thinking I was still trapped in a barn or dead in a ditch. I didn't have the luxury of a stealthy entry. The clock on Miller's ventilator was ticking. I needed a distraction that would pull the security away from the internal elevators without triggering a full lockdown. I looked at Shepard. "Stay," I whispered, tapping the dashboard. She understood the weight of the command. I climbed out of the truck, moving through the shadows of the parking garage, carrying a small electronic jammer I'd rigged from the SUV's parts. This wasn't about a frontal assault. This was about creating a vacuum. In the darkness, the world becomes a tactical map. As the jammer hummed to life, the security feed for the North Wing went into a loop, a 10-second ghost of an empty hallway playing on repeat. The guards outside the private wing reacted instantly, their radios crackling with confused reports of a localized blackout. While they moved to investigate the perimeter breach, I was already in the service stairwell, my boots making no sound on the concrete. My heart rate was a steady 60 beats per minute. Fear is a waste of energy. I replaced it with the mental blueprint of the 4th floor. Miller was in room 412. The data on the drive told me that the maintenance staff on that floor were actually Vance's personal security detail. I reached the 4th floor landing and paused, the scent of antiseptic and floor wax filling my lungs. This was the moment where the past and the present collided.
Speed is the ultimate equalizer. The guard didn't even have time to register a threat before I was in his personal space. I didn't use a weapon. I used leverage. A sharp strike to the carotid sinus, and he was unconscious before his knees hit the linoleum. I caught him before his gear could clatter, sliding him into an empty linen closet. One down. I moved toward 412. The door was heavy, reinforced with a magnetic lock. I pulled the tablet from my vest, the one I'd taken from Victor. I'd spent the drive over rewriting its permissions. With a soft click, the magnet disengaged. I stepped inside. The room was bathed in the rhythmic blue glow of a ventilator. Miller looked smaller than I remembered, his skin like parchment, but his eyes were open. He was awake, and he was terrified.
"I've got it, Miller," I whispered, my voice thick with a decade of suppressed grief. "I've got the drive. I know about Nightingale. I know about Vance." The old soldier tried to speak, the tube in his throat making it impossible, but the grip he had on my hand was like iron. It wasn't the grip of a dying man. It was the grip of a man who had been holding a secret for 20 years and was finally ready to let go. I checked the monitors. His vitals were stable, but the internal alarms had likely already reached Vance's headquarters. We had minutes. I pulled a portable oxygen tank from the emergency rack and began the delicate process of switching him over. "We're going home, Miller, to the farm. The dog is waiting."
The sirens were a chorus of the old world trying to keep its grip on the truth. But I wasn't the boy who cried at a funeral anymore. I was the storm that Vance had helped create, and I was finally making landfall. As the elevator doors slid shut, I realized that the farm wasn't just a place to hide. It was the staging ground for the final act. We had the witness. We had the data. And most importantly, we had the moral high ground. The drive wasn't just evidence. It was a weapon, and I was going to make sure the world heard it fire. The resolution wasn't in an escape. It was in the reckoning that was about to follow.
The farm was no longer a sanctuary. It was a fortress. We arrived under the cover of the pre-dawn mist, the kind of gray blanket that hides tracks and muffles the soul. Miller was stabilized in the back room of the house, Shepard standing guard at the foot of his bed like a sentinel from an ancient myth. I spent the hour before sunrise prepping the transmission. Vance's reach was long, but digital truth is a wildfire. Once it catches, no amount of influence can stomp it out. I had rigged the farm's old satellite dish to bypass local towers, pointing it directly at a secure, independent server in Switzerland. This wasn't just about a local news leak. This was about a global broadcast. The data was ready.
The witness was safe. Now I just had to wait for the man who thought he owned the world to come and try to take it back.
I saw them coming from 2 miles out. Vance didn't send a tactical team this time. He came himself. He wanted to look me in the eye when he tried to bury the past. I didn't lock the gate. I didn't hide in the rafters. I stood in the middle of the driveway, the cold morning air filling my lungs, feeling the weight of my father's legacy in the palm of my hand. As the SUV screeched to a halt, a dozen men in suits stepped out, but they stayed back. The middle door opened, and General Silas Vance stepped onto the dirt. He looked older, his uniform crisp, but his eyes were hollow. He looked at the barn, then at me, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of genuine fear behind his arrogance. He knew he wasn't facing a retired soldier. He was facing the consequence of every lie he'd ever told.
"You're making a mistake, James," Vance said, his voice barely rising above the wind. "You think you're a hero, but you're just a catalyst for chaos. That drive contains names of assets that are currently keeping this country safe." I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the smallness of his soul. "The only thing those names are keeping safe, Silas, is your pension and your seat at the table. My father died for a flag. You sold that flag to the highest bidder." I held up the tablet, the upload button glowing red. "It's already done. The second my thumb leaves this screen, the server in Zurich mirrors the files to every major investigative bureau on the planet. Your Project Nightingale is about to become a household name."
Vance looked past me, his eyes landing on Miller. The color drained from his face as if he'd seen a ghost, which, in a way, he had. Seeing the man he thought he'd silenced standing in the light of day was the final blow. There was no tactical move left, no bribe large enough, no threat dark enough. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the silence of a career ending, of a legacy crumbling into ash. Vance looked at his men, then back at me, and I saw him realize that his power had evaporated the moment I chose not to be afraid. "You can't win this, James," he whispered. I looked at Shepard, then at Miller, and finally back at the man who had betrayed them all. "I already have, Silas. I'm going home. You're going to prison." The helicopters weren't Vance's. They were the first wave of the fallout. The truth had landed. As I walked back toward the porch, I felt a weight lift that I hadn't even known I was carrying. The farm was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet, a clean, honest silence. Miller met me at the door, his hand gripping my shoulder with a strength that said more than words ever could. We weren't just survivors anymore. We were the ones who stayed behind to tell the story. I looked out over the fields, at the barn where it all began, and realized that my father had been right. The past isn't a burden if you have the courage to face it. I sat on the porch step, Shepard resting her head on my knee, and watched the sun rise on a world that was finally, for the first time in 20 years, exactly what it appeared to be. The mission was over. The peace was real.